Morning again. This is a remote workshop in case number 25-1253 INV, the Commission's investigation regarding the definition of plant pursuant to Act 38 of 2025. My name is Steph Hoffman. I'm General Counsel at the Public Utility Commission. Wes Skidmore, Jake Marin, and Rowan Cornell Brown are Commission staff also attending the workshop today. We are recording this workshop and a Teams generated transcript will be created. If anyone on this Teams workshop intends to record the hearing themselves, either via audio or video, please indicate that when you introduce yourself. We're going to try to go around and have each person introduce themselves for the purposes of Teams and the record. And we'll start with the department, and if one representative of groups of people want to just introduce their folks that are on the call, that's also fine, but just we're trying to cover everyone on the screen if possible.
Sure. Michael Swain here for the Department of Public Service, and with me is Ann Margolis.
Great. Does Rev want to introduce themselves?
Good morning, I'm Jonathan Dowds at Renewable Energy Vermont, and with me is Peter Sterling, also from REV.
VCE.
This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment, and Allison Despathy is with me, and I am audio recording.
Thank you. Saw Attorney Mullet.
Yes, David Mullet, General Counsel, All Earth Renewables.
Thank you. Mr. Watson.
Good morning. I'm Drew Watson for the Nature Conservancy in Vermont.
Thank you. Attorney Malone.
Hi, good morning. Michael Malone on behalf of Alco Renewable Energy.
Thank you. Attorney Buffard. Oh, you're on mute.
Good morning, this is Deborah Buffard from Sheehy, Furlong and Beam.
Thank you. I believe there's a few others, but I can't tell based on the way my screen is oriented. If I haven't had you introduce yourself, can you just pop off mute?
Hey, Steph, this is Billy Coster for the Agency of Natural Resources.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Adam McGeary. I'm an attorney with Conservation Law Foundation.
Thank you.
Johanna Miller, Vermont Natural Resources Council. Good morning.
Good morning.
Ann Janda from Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission.
Thank you.
Kamran Hassan, Green Mountain Power.
Lisa Siri with the department.
Good morning. Great, I think we might have gotten everyone. Great. So quickly, first, I just want to review some brief procedures for a remote workshop. Participants may raise concerns about the procedures themselves now, or if you're having any technical issues at any point during the workshop. To facilitate the remote nature of this workshop and to minimize unexpected interruptions, we ask that anyone who wishes to speak turn your camera on while you're speaking. And you can leave your camera on if you are interested in participating for as long as you want. If you plan to just listen for the entire workshop, it is helpful to turn your camera off to allow folks to change the view and see who's actively participating. We will not mute anyone's microphone, so please keep yourself on mute unless you are speaking. And to indicate you want to speak, there are a few options. You can simply unmute your microphone and and have your camera on. I'll try my best to acknowledge you. You can click the button to raise your hand on Teams. It's literally an open hand like this. And periodically, I'll also ask if anyone would like to participate by contributing, speaking up, asking questions, and just leave the floor open. It's very important that we try to avoid talking over each other. In a platform like Teams, that's difficult, I understand, but if there is talking over, the transcript will be harder to read. So we'll just ask you to repeat individually if that happens. And if your internet connection cuts out at any time or you get disconnected from this call, please try to rejoin. And if you're unable to, you can reach out to the clerk and she'll notify us that someone has fallen off the call. And if it's a participant that is associated with someone else or someone notices, please feel free to chime in and let us know that we've lost a participant and we need to try to get them back on the call. Does anyone have any questions or concerns about those procedures at this time? All right. With that covered, we'll begin the substantive portion of the workshop. To date, the commission has received 3 definitions seeking to sort of amend the current definition of plant under 30 VSA 8002-18. Those definitions are from Renewable Energy Vermont, ALCO, and the department. What we plan to do going forward, including today at the workshop, is to take comments on these various proposals from the participants, and the commission is tasked with drafting a recommendation to the legislature that is due by November 1st, which is actually a Saturday, so probably October 31st. We have to obtain a final round of We would like to obtain a final round of comments from the parties on the various proposals and other issues that are being raised in this proceeding. And we think the best way of facilitating this is for the commission after this workshop to issue a draft version of our recommendation based on all the feedback we've received to date, and then allow all the participants an opportunity to comment on that draft recommendation. So we will be taking all the comments to date and the comments from this workshop, and then making our proposed recommendation and putting that out in the proceeding. There are also some bigger picture issues or other issues that have been raised in the comments, as well as minor technical and wording issues with definitions that we recognize might be better addressed in written comments. So don't feel that you have to cover all topics in this proceeding. You're also welcome to file comments leading up to that final comment deadline about any other matters that have been raised in this proceeding. So today we'll discuss the following aspects of what has been filed so far. We want to hone in the department's proposal on 2 elements. The recommendation that the definition of plant include a concept regarding preferred sites and also constrained areas. We will then turn more generally to the department's proposal and take any additional concerns, comments, or questions about what the department submitted on the 12th. Then we will take concerns, comments, or questions or discussion points about REV's proposal. And finally, concerns, comments, or questions about ALCO's proposal. And then the department identified a few issues in its comments on the 12th that they viewed as warranted for discussion, and those are defining project boundaries, assessing environmental impacts, and assessing cumulative impacts. So we wanted to provide some space in this workshop for either questions about those issues or initial feedback, concerns, how those issues might be relevant to the recommendation the commission is tasked with providing the legislature. And then we want to leave space at the end for other issues that any party on this call would like to discuss with this group. So each of those topics for an hour and a half means about 15 minutes on each. So I'll try my best to keep us moving through so we can get questions and comments addressed on each of those topics. Anything about the agenda that anyone wants to raise, or we can move right into the first topic? Yes, Mr. Dowds.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight that REV's concern with the department's proposal is that we believe the legislative intent behind launching this process was to eliminate barriers to co-location. So before we get into the specifics of the definition of a preferred site or the definition of a constrained area, I feel like I have to make the general comment that imposing new restrictions that apply only to the second site, the second project built on a site rather than the first project built on the site, we think undermines that intent or is counter to that intent. So while we're happy to provide specific comments about preferred sites and about grid constrained areas, fundamentally we think that adding conditions for second projects that do not apply for first projects is what this process was intended to eliminate. So I did want to make that overarching comment before we got into the specifics of those two criteria.
Thank you. And I'm happy to take some more general comments about the department's proposal first. Just wanted to make sure that we save time for understanding what those concepts are and how they're proposed in this context, given the nature of the department's submission, and that there were some areas of ambiguity and questions of how those concepts would be defined. So anyone else want to make any general comments on the department's proposal? First, we do have time saved for that as well. Okay, I would ask if someone from the department might be able to provide just a brief understanding overview of what sources of information or reference points or pathways would be used for those concepts in your mind, and how those concepts sort of how would they play out given the way the definition is currently proposed.
Could be me, or do you want to step on your toes here, Michael?
No, please. I was going to ask if you wanted to get us started on this one, so please go ahead.
Great. Ann Margolis, Department of Public Service. So the two definitions are around preferred sites or preferred areas, and also constrained areas of the grid. Just briefly, I, in response to what Jonathan's comment, I understand there's an intent to make it easier to co-locate, but I don't think that's the department's view is that's not full stop. And there was legislative discussion around making it easier to co-locate in good areas that we can all agree are areas where we should see leaning in on additional solar development beyond what we've already seen. And we've had lots of discussion. Various parties have had a lot of discussion in the legislature, and also in many cases and proceedings before the commission around what are good sites, where do we want to see additional or future solar development. And we know that there are concerns around both grid constrained areas, so areas of the distribution or transmission system that are experiencing points of saturation where there are impacts on existing generation that's ratepayer funded, and potentially the need to build new infrastructure those costs in many instances would be assessed to ratepayers. So we want to avoid leaning in on those areas of the grid. And then preferred areas, the current definition, there's two definitions of preferred areas right now. There's the definition in the standard offer part of statute that was put in place. That was sort of the original genesis of the preferred sites concepts. And it's a very static definition that lives in statute. It was only for a pilot program purpose. And then that eventually migrated into the net metering rule when net metering 2.0 came along. And the definition of preferred sites in the net metering rule is much more modern and has been reformed through time through a lot of stakeholder input and net metering rulemakings. And it covers a lot of different areas, sort of natural resource impacts. So the 248B5 type criteria, when you are, there's basically looking at if you are leaning in on preferred sites, like landfills, gravel pits, brownfields. These are parking lots, rooftops. These are already disturbed areas. So those are areas where there's been an express intent by the legislature, the commission, and others to direct development to those already disturbed areas, thereby avoiding additional natural resource impacts. There's also from aesthetics, orderly development, land use perspective, the regional and municipal preferred sites, so the local preferred sites, which may not be sort of an already disturbed area, they might be a so-called greenfield. But if they have been sort of reviewed from the perspective of do they have good solar, other renewable resource potential, are they unconstrained by the types of natural resources we can map, you know, just at the mapping level, not on-site investigation that would happen in the 248 review. But those are areas where towns and regions have said these are areas that have potential. And then through the preferred site mechanism, there's review of and discussion at the local level of really specific sites in context of a specific proposal being made for development of a project. And then that mechanism of the preferred site letter can enable sort of a greenfield site to be considered a preferred site. So, you know, I think in our mind, the net metering definition is the most useful definition to point to, but it's obviously in the context of the net metering rule right now. Whereas if it were used in this single plant definition, it would be maybe at least awkward for a broader definition to point to a definition in a specific rule for a specific program. So perhaps that could be changed into its own rule for a preferred site that could be developed, and many programs could point to it. Also to Jonathan, to your other point around, you know, is it only the second or third project that would be subject to this definition? I think we've expressed in other programmatic contexts that preferred sites, constrained areas should be broadly considered in renewable generation program and rate setting. So perhaps it's a more universal definition that could be applied to a bunch of different programs. So it would affect not only first projects, but subsequent projects coming in. Or if not, its own separate rule, perhaps a general order, since that's more nimble and can be changed through time, and potentially bring in something like a definition of constrained areas of the grid at some point.
Mr. Malone.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Was the legislative mandate that we taken another look at the single plant test, did that mandate include differentiating between quote unquote incentive programs and as opposed to, you know, market-based renewable development? Just a question.
So the whole text of the requirement that the commission provide a recommendation essentially says that the commission shall submit a recommended amended definition of plant in 30 VSA section 8218 and an overview of their process and explanation of the recommendation to the committees of jurisdiction. And we have to consider three things: land use benefits of co-location of energy generation facilities, the ability to ensure comprehensive review of co-located facilities, and the potential impacts to ratepayers associated with co-located facilities. So that is the extent of the directive.
Okay, so I'm guessing that the distinguishing between incentive programs and non-incentive programs, that's coming under the third prong of that mandate?
That's how it's been characterized in the comments so far. Both, my understanding is both Rev's definition and the department's definition include some aspect of that concept, sort of embedding the current programs in the consideration.
With the idea being that the incentive programs would have a greater impact on Vermont ratepayers?
I'm happy to I know Mr. Dowds has been nodding and also has his hand up, or anyone from the department to comment on the intent behind including that information in your proposals.
Yeah, I can comment on that briefly. My understanding from the conversation in the legislature is that the Public Service Department and Public Utility Commission both raised concerns that building that making this change without carving out both net metering and standard offer would raise the specter of raising rates for rate payers. I will note that REV has never been clear on how allowing co-location of standard offer projects, which are part of a competitive bid process, leaving aside the few technology blocks that have a set price. REV is not clear how that would have an adverse impact on ratepayers, but my understanding is that this is in response to the concerns raised by the Public Service Department and the Public Utility Commission about net metering and standard offer specifically. In response to Ms. Margolis's comments, starting with constrained areas, all energy projects are responsible for any system costs associated with safely interconnecting those projects. And we at REV believe that this is an appropriate mechanism for balancing grid impacts against other metrics for site desirability. We recognize that the PSD has raised concerns about cumulative impacts to the grid that may not be captured in these interconnection studies and interconnection upgrades. Outside of the Shiai region, which is a bit of a unique case, our understanding is that this is primarily arises due to the continued installation of smaller net metering projects in areas that are near capacity, that those projects just have limited review. So fundamentally, we think the projects that are likely to be built as a result of a change in this plant definition are not the kinds of projects that are most likely to have an impact on these constrained areas, that is outside of the scope of the interconnection upgrades that they pay for. And we believe, and I think Ms. Margolis alluded to this as well, that this is not really the appropriate venue to parse and address these concerns. The result of doing so in this investigation would be to recreate criteria that disadvantage co-location relative to projects built on undeveloped land. Don't see the rationale for doing that. So if this constrained area and cumulative impacts is something that needs to be addressed, we think that ought to be its own standalone effort rather than applying it to a narrow subset of projects. Touching briefly on preferred sites, REV really supports towns, municipalities working on energy siting and being proactive about that. The history so far is that the quality of these plans is fairly variable. It's not unusual to see large areas of wetlands because they are undeveloped and not suitable for development being flagged as preferred sites for renewables. And we think there are just some technical barriers to these plans being totally useful, and again don't want to see it applied to a subset of projects that disadvantage co-location of solar. We think that's counterproductive. So again, think that is best suited for some other proceeding if the department wants this to become a universal element for renewable siting rather than simply something that impacts the net metering project as it has historically.
I have a quick clarifying question, if that's okay, Mr. Dowds. In discussing the grid constraints portion, can you clarify, you made a reference and I just wasn't totally clear on about you're not really sure that some of the projects you foresee in development would be impacted by that language or that language would come into play at all. Were you referring to the fact that they won't be located in the Shiai, or am I misunderstanding you?
What I was saying is that from conversation with PSD staff, we understand that the projects which are sort of most likely to have cumulative impacts that aren't measured by an interconnection study are smaller net metering projects. We believe that smaller net metering projects, which are on site, are unlikely to be, their development is unlikely to be changed by changes to the definition of plant. So that's why we don't think that changes to this plant definition will impact those projects, those smaller net metering projects that are on site.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, Ann Margolis.
Yes, I just want to respond briefly and just refer folks to the Velco 2024 Velco Long Range Transmission Plan. My colleague Lou Ciceri is here with me as well, and he can speak to it in greater detail if folks want to get into greater detail on it. But a message in the long range plan was really, if we lean in on the historic sort of geographical deployment of solar, we won't be optimally using the grid, and there may be necessitated transmission and subtransmission upgrades required because of non-optimal siting. There is a map in the long range plan of optimized siting by sort of transmission region, which, you know, we could pull up if we want to, but essentially showing a lot of capacity available in the southern part of the state. And as you get north, there's less and less capacity. And by each sort of transmission region in the state, it shows the available kind of amount of headroom that there is for additional generation. And I think Jonathan mentioned the interconnection agreements. It's not really, you know, the utilities, and they're here, they can speak up as well, but they're looking for safe and reliable interconnection to the grid, and they will. The distribution utilities, some of them, GMP, VEC, and BED, have solar maps that will show sort of color-coded way, but an additional available headroom, and then in interconnection agreements, they may be negotiating, you know, whether there's a limit, you have export limits in when you're getting close to some of the headroom on those distribution transformers, but they are not necessarily capturing, and they can correct me if I'm wrong here, the sort of additional consumption of headroom on the transmission system. There are projects that have been located in the Shiai region, those larger standard offer projects, for instance, where there have been negotiations around assessing a per kW fee for the economic impact of those projects to backing down repair-funded generation, such as Kingdom Community Wind. But that is not necessarily part of the interconnection review. That's sort of a separate review that's going on, and it's negotiating on a case-by-case basis. There was the introduction in the net metering rule of the locational adjuster fee, which is section 5.136, where utilities have the option to develop tariffs that would capture both distribution and transmission constraints or sort of consumption of available headroom and those economic and grid impacts. And we haven't seen utilities at this point actually developing and offering those tariffs up for review. But if they were to be developed, that would be one sort of reference point for constrained areas of the grid.
Thank you for that. I want to give Mr. Watson a chance. He has his hand up.
Thank you. I didn't want to step in front of you, Jonathan. Drew Watson, Nature Conservancy in Vermont. I guess what I'm trying to understand is if we are defining constrained areas of the transmission and distribution system in this specific definition, but not in the larger conversation about utility scale solar, are we creating perverse incentive for people to avoid trying to co-locate solar so that they don't have to pass the test of a constrained area as we're talking about defining it? So if you had an option to site a new project on undeveloped land or a co-located project, does this proposal say that only one of those would face the test of a constrained area of the transmission system? And if so, are we creating disincentive to approach co-location in a positive way? Thank you.
I'm happy to let Ann Margolis respond to that if that's okay with you, Mr. Dowds. And you're still on mute.
All right. I think that's a interesting point. Again, we have advocated for that concept to be applied more broadly to all of the various programs. And, you know, the cleanest way to do that is to have the locational adjuster fee tariffs, which that part is in the net metering rule right now, but it says in the text that it can be used as a it's more broadly applicable than just the net metering rule or net metering projects. So, you know, ideally that would be something that many programs could reference if it were to be developed, but that's like a potentially years-long process, you know, even once those are developed and proposed, you know, years to potentially another year to have the review of those, the regulatory review of those and implementation. So, you know, whatever happens here with the development of the new single plant definition may happen much sooner than those locational adjuster fee tariffs take place and come into being if they ever do, which we hope they do. So, you know, I think we look at this change to the single plant definition as, you know, as it currently stands, it precludes co-locating of generation projects without passing numerous tests. And I think our proposal was really an attempt to recognize that there is a desire to co-locate. Not to co-locate, you know, wantonly wherever without consideration of what we know are the issues around grid constraints and natural resource impacts, you know, with preferred sites being a proxy for those. And yes, the preferred sites are not specifically mapped for the most part in the regional plans. There are potential sites, and then it really comes down to those letters from the regions and towns to look at what a preferred site is. And if there's identifying wetlands, that sounds like an issue with the map. So there's just state layers that are being compiled together. There's folks from the region and A&R in here who could speak to those and why that might be the case. But I think we really look at this change to single plant as opening up, right? We're allowing a new thing. We're allowing co-location in a lot more places with a lot fewer tests than we used to, but we need to create, you know, at least recognize where the utilities, the transmission operator, and the regions and towns have done a lot of work to say, no, we really do understand where it's best to locate generation from these different perspectives, the grid and the land use, orderly development and environmental perspective. So let's work that in here, even if, yes, it should be worked in programs more broadly, but one is going to happen before the other. So let's make sure we don't lose this opportunity.
Mr. Dowds, you've been waiting patiently now.
I just wanted to make a quick comment about the Velco long-range transmission plan. We think that was a very valuable piece of work. As Ms. Margolis noted, the high grid constraint scenario was one that assumed just the replication of the historical pattern of renewable development. We think that is unlikely to occur precisely because of those grid constraints. So I'd caution against using that as a roadmap for what will happen. I also want to push back against the notion that it would be better to implement some of these ideas more quickly in the context of single plant versus in a more deliberate process for all projects. More quickly making it difficult to co-locate projects does not seem like a desirable end, particularly if you have a project that is one parcel over that can do all of the same thing. So we see this as eliminating the potential for the lowest cost, least impact projects. Any site where there is a project, that project has already obtained a CPG, has already gone through extensive review. The second project would have to go through all of that review again. And this is a place where I have a question, specifically where we at REV would like a better understanding of what kind of cumulative impacts either the Public Service Department or the Agency of Natural Resources are concerned about. In our experience, the CPG process and the evaluation of all of those 248 criteria is quite rigorous. And we don't see why a second project on a site would somehow escape scrutiny simply because it is the second project.
So I'm assuming Lou wants to respond on the transmission, the Velco long-range plan, and then, is that right, Lou? Am I characterizing while
That's
you
right.
raise your hand? I'll let
Yeah.
you start there, and then I see that Billy Coster has raised his hand, perhaps to respond to the second part of Mr. Dowd's question.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just keep my comments limited to transmission constraints and study thereof. Like Ms. Margolis said earlier, it's difficult to pin any particular study to the single source of truth. As we know, there are many different elements that go into transmission study. And so we can look at maybe the worst case or the best case, as Mr. Dowd's referred to, looking at one particular case with the extension of present deployment patterns of solar across the state may not be the most realistic, and it may change over time. But what Velco did in this previous analysis in the 2024 plan, the most recent analysis, was to show that deployment patterns really have not changed much over the past several planning cycles from 2018 to 2021 to 2024. And so absent any other information to that effect, any policy that would notably shift where solar is being deployed, it seemed reasonable for them to continue to study that scenario. They also studied an optimized distribution of solar across the state that shows what's the best case, what could fit in each zone of the state. And that's figure 20 in the 2024 long range plan that shows that the upper limit of solar hosting capacity is much lower in the northern part of the state. And that's done by planning zone, of which I think there are 13 across the state. So it gives some granularity as to where in the state solar can or can't be accommodated without additional transmission reinforcement. So there are tools that exist to show where transmission can accommodate additional solar. And beyond that, we would have to look at the distribution system and the distribution utilities mapping thereof.
Thank you, and I'm gonna turn now to Billy Coster.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to respond quickly to the question about analyzing cumulative impact. As Mr. Dowd said, I agree that the 248 process is thorough and looks at project impacts. I think when we're looking cumulatively, though, we do need to look at the impacts of the previous facility at the site. And the issue is more not that the criteria is sufficient, but that the application materials will need to provide information about those initial impacts, so the totality can be considered by the commission and other parties. So it's more about the level of information provided for the project being co-located at the site about the previous impacts, so they could all be taken into consideration.
And then I saw Annette Smith raised her hand.
Yes, thank you. So I'm glad that Lou talked about the distribution utilities, because there are a lot of constraints within the distribution system. And I think I would put forward the idea that we have seen a lot of solar development in the wrong places as it relates to the grid. And so this general idea of allowing expansion of existing sites, I think very much does need to take into consideration the build close to load, build next to load. That should be our goal, so that it minimizes the transmission impacts. I'd like to take a step back a little bit and try and understand what change we're talking about. We now have a statute that talks about that they have to be separate roads and can't be common ownership, and a series of things that my understanding was initially based on wind turbines. And so I would like the PUC's evaluation of this to also include how any proposed change may affect a wind project. If you're allowing an addition of one turbine after another, just because it has a road going up to it and has a grid infrastructure, is that the intent of changing it, or is the purpose of the single plant rule that eliminates the ability to just keep adding a turbine one after another over the years. How does that continue to be addressed? Because right now I'm very confused about how this might affect wind projects in terms of what's being proposed. So that has not come up in any of the comments. My other piece that I think I need to say is that definitely support the idea of adding to existing disturbed sites like quarries and landfills. Some of those are not necessarily located near load, which is another challenge. But you may have some greenfield sites that if there's a road going to them and there's power lines going to them would be, supported by this rule change, but it may involve a parcel that has completely new adjoiners and completely new issues. And I want to make sure that the public interest and the ability to participate is preserved in any rule change, and that the full process does not get minimized. I'm aware of one case. It's somewhere in the southeastern part of the state. I'm not exactly sure. It was quite a few years ago, but the neighbors all felt that there had been a finality, that they were promised that this was all there was going to be. And then they were very disturbed when something got added to it. And it may even have happened, it was added to, and then it came back into the process. Like I said, I don't really remember the details, except that it resulted in a fair amount of upset by the community who felt that they had been promised that there would just be this one project. And so there is this ongoing question of finality when the community or neighbors participate and get an outcome that they feel is finished, then can people just keep coming back and adding and adding and adding? And I don't have any suggestions for how to address that in a rule change, but I do think it's important to recognize that there is an extensive public interest in what happens when a site is approved, permitted, and then, oh wait, there's more. So those are my initial comments. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. And I want to make sure we leave enough time to get to some of the other proposals. So, Mr. Dowds, if you'd like a chance, and Billy Coster to respond briefly on these points, but I do think we now have a better understanding of what issues are in play based on the department's proposal. So should you want to elaborate on the concerns that are raised by those proposals or some of the points you raised today, I want to encourage filing written explanations. But if you'd like, Mr. Dodds, you can certainly.
I was just going to loop back on transmission, but we can put those in writing.
Great. And Mr. Coster?
Yeah, just quickly to Annette's comment about finality, I just want to point out, while it's a different jurisdiction in Act 250, the bar to permit amendments or additions to existing projects is higher than original jurisdiction for that exact reason, because once parties believe an activity is concluded at a site, for that to be reopened, or if there needs to be conditions amended at that site, it's actually a higher standard that needs to be met to allow that to move forward.
Thank you for that. And I want to give a chance now, similar to the department, for whoever at Rev would like to do this, to sort of explain or lay out any differences in your proposal that you think are important to highlight for the group and focus their comments and focus the commission's attention if that's something you want, and then allow folks to respond or comment on Rev's proposal.
Sure, I can comment briefly on Rev's proposal. Our approach essentially was that the single plant consideration should be eliminated, except for in those narrow subset of cases where there could be an adverse ratepayer impact. Again, the Public Service Department and Public Utility Commission identified those as being net metering and standard offer projects. Consequently, in deference to that position, we left the current single plant practice in place for those projects, which could have for PSD and PUC an adverse ratepayer impact. But otherwise, for projects that are developed by a PPA or some sort of competitive process, we don't see any reason that they should be disadvantaged for being the second project on the site. So we, in some ways, began with a different default assumption than the Public Service Department, that single plant should not generally be considered, whereas PSD maintained single plant should be considered for all project types. We said single plant should not be considered for competitive PPA RFP projects. And we included a 10 megawatt capacity limit to preserve general alignment with the tier 2 criterion. So that was the gist of the REV proposal.
Can I ask 2 questions about the REV proposal before? I'm not seeing any immediate hands shoot up that are based on also what you just highlighted, Mr. Dowds. First, could you explain sort of from REV's perspective, the difference between preserving the current tests for net metering and standard offer projects as they exist under the statutes now, and the construct that the department has created in their proposal, mostly, I think, in kind of exceptions B and C. Obviously, A is about located near load, but sort of this concept of you are a plant, one plant, if you meet the general definition, is my understanding, but that they have offered sort of options out. So just the difference between this model and REV's model in terms of, let's say, your example about competitive PPA situations.
Yep.
Where's the difference there?
So under the Public Service Department's model, a project that sought a competitive PPA would have to go through exception B or C, as you said. And that means that the project would be subject to several criteria that would not apply if a virtually identical project were built on a greenfield. Specifically, it would have to be a preferred site. We're concerned about the implementation of that, and again, don't see it as appropriate to apply it to this narrow subset of projects. You would have to not be in a grid constrained area. And in the case of exception C, it would have to be offer its power at avoided cost rather than the price determined by this competitive process. We think that one is particularly counterproductive. That means that if you had, say, a 3 megawatt project that was the second project on a site, and it could offer it, bid into an RFP at 10 cents to put a number on it, and the avoided cost was 9.5, and another project down the road put in a bid at 10.5 cents. That 10-cent project, even though it would save ratepayers money, would be ineligible because it would become part of a single plant, because it wasn't offering an avoided cost. And so the utility would be forced to purchase from that 10.5-cent project. So the big distinguisher in my mind is that the Public Service Department's proposal includes 3 restrictions that only apply to the second or third project on a site: preferred siting, grid constraints, and avoided cost, whereas REVs puts those projects on equal footing unless they are part of net metering or standard offer.
So just a follow-up to that part of your explanation, if you had B1, B2, would that be without 3.4? Would that be equivalent? So you eliminate the preferred site element and the grid constraint element. Is that sort of way of characterizing
I'm scrolling over to, okay, so,
So the facilities are interconnected behind separate retail electricity meters is one, and two is
Yep.
participate in different electric generation incentive programs or contractual agreements, except such as sales. I could finish reading it, but are those two equivalent from
I
Rev's
think,
perspective?
I think
to
that
the-
would get us, pretty close. We would want to read through B2 pretty closely, but as I read that in my conversation with Public Service Department, is that would mean you could have no more than one net metering or single plant, one net metering or standard offer project on a parcel. But that if other projects were part of some sort of competitive bid PPA process, they'd be allowed. I think that is quite similar to what we view as the legislative intent. So first blush, yes, I think that would be pretty equivalent.
And I think the commission would find it helpful if in writing you all could flesh out if there were any differences between B1 plus 2 and Rev's sort of intent behind the proposal. What are those differences if there are any, and what would need to change with this definition, just so we can understand that portion. I should have clarified initially. I certainly understand the preferred site, grid constraint, and avoided cost elements. Then the second question I had was about your last point on Rev's proposal about including the 10 megawatt sort of capacity limit. Just curious about embedding a capacity limit in the plant definition and some of the concerns that have been raised during this conversation, and whether and how that implicates other portions of Title 30 and some of the capacity limits there, particularly the current 5 megawatt threshold. It's not quite a limit because there's a process beyond it for the res, but I'm just curious about Rev's inclusion of the 10 megawatt in this proposal, as opposed to suggesting a change to the res statute, for example.
Sure. So during the legislative discussion around this, one of the concerns that was raised was, what if you have a project that was quote unquote truly a tier 4 type project? This is a project larger than 5 megawatts. You had a 30 megawatt solar project that would be eligible to generate tier 4 RECs. What would stop that project from artificially being divided into 6 5 megawatt tier 2 projects? I want to note that in general, Rev does not view this as a very practical concern. Our members tell us that they would much rather go through a single permitting process than go through 6 simultaneously. There are lots of costs and uncertainties associated with that. So, this is Rev attempting to address concerns raised by others, rather than, viewing this as a probable outcome, regardless of what the definition is. But so from that concern, what if we had a 30 megawatt project that was conceived of as a single unit, but the tier 2 REC price went up and somebody partitioned it off. So this is an attempt to allay that concern. As we noted in our initial written comments, many other states use a slightly larger definition of distributed generation than Vermont does. Vermont in tier 2 uses 5 megawatts. Other states use 10, 15, some as high as 30. We thought allowing 10 megawatts to be built in a single location would still capture the benefits provided by distributed generation, balanced against sort of maximizing the use of sites that are cheap to interconnect and have sort of the lowest environmental impact. So that was the rationale for using that threshold. We're certainly open to other approaches to addressing that concern, if it is still one that Public Service Department or others have.
Thank you so much for that explanation. I want to, oh, yes, Ms. Smith.
Yes, I wonder if it would be possible to get an example of a specific site that is currently developed that could be envisioned to be a 10 megawatt site by expanding. And in other words, I think we're talking about probably 40 or 50 acres. Do we have landfills or quarries that could host that size of a site, or are we talking about expanding into greenfields and forests? I'm just having trouble conceptualizing a 10 megawatt project that is the result of this rule change, um, being on what we might consider a preferred site. Is anybody aware of an existing site that could be expanded to allow for a 50-acre project?
Appreciate
And
the.
I mean, if not, I'm not, we're living in an abstract world here. I'm trying to understand specific details on the ground of what's happening in Vermont. That's where I work. And so, uh, I have real concerns about this 10 megawatt idea. Other states have a lot more land that's not squeezed in between mountains. We are in a unique situation here. Siting is challenging. And we have not maximized the built landscape by any means. And so everything we can do to push development into parking lots and areas that are already built and that are close to load is where I think we need to be going as a state policy. But just to change this one definition to enable a 10 megawatt solar project just because it's located next to an existing site, that's very concerning. And I just want to understand where and how what that would look like.
Billy Coster?
Thanks. Yeah, I had a similar question because my interpretation of this proposal is more focused on new development where a likely scenario would be 2 5 megawatt facilities being proposed at a new location and built kind of simultaneously or in close proximity to each other time-wise, and whether that has some sort of disconnect with the extensive public conversation around the updated res that significantly increased the tier 2 in-state contribution with a lot of focus on that 5 megawatt project cap. So I'm not saying that I oppose this concept, but it does feel like it needs to be squared somehow with the very public debate around the 5 megawatt tier 2 cap that was the foundation for the recent expansion of the res.
And Mr. Watson?
I have a slightly different point, so I didn't know if anybody wanted to respond to Mr. Costa or anybody else before I go. Okay. I guess my question around whether you could place another 5 megawatt at an existing location and end up with 10 megawatts is, if that project is going to be built as a second 5 megawatt project regardless, with separate infrastructure, separate roads, separate everything for distribution upgrades, if that project's going to take place regardless of whether or not it's co-located, wouldn't the preference then be for it to be co-located, even if there's marginal environmental impact on the co-located site? It's likely going to be less than doing an entirely new 5 megawatt project in a nearby or differing location. So again, what I come back to is we're trying to make it easier to co-locate and minimize impacts. And it feels like res proposal makes it easier to do that, whereas preventing that situation would make it harder.
I think Mr. Aguirre, am I saying that correctly? Was second?
Yeah, it's Aguirre, but it's
Aguirre.
close enough. Thank you.
Sorry.
No. To the point about the living in abstract world, I think that's a really good point. And one of the a countervailing point would just be, I've looked at a few different town energy plans and their preferred siting, and I think as Jonathan kind of pointed out, they really do vary in quality and accuracy, not, I think, in any nefarious sort of way, but in a way that like there's not as many resources to verify and ensure that the way that they're mapping is true. And even I think some of the state level data is, you know, when you get that granular, I think it's hard. And I think we've heard from the regional planning commissions that like the granularity of the data is a real problem. And so I guess I would be interested in just if we're imagining where these projects could take place, it would also be great or helpful to think through kind of how municipalities are thinking through this, like looking at a couple of plans to make sure, you know, if you're saying a preferred site is on wetlands, for example, or, you know, in an unsuitable place that's not going to meet the B5 criteria, that would just be really helpful too, so that we have a real accurate picture of what the siting constraints actually are.
Mr. Dowds?
I wanted to reiterate something that Mr. Watson said, which is that the total amount of solar that will be built in Vermont will be determined by the res. And so this conversation about single plant is really about where those projects are located. And we would like to see when it makes sense financially for ratepayers, when it can pass muster with the, as Mr. Coster said, very rigorous 248 process, that co-located projects be given an equal opportunity to fill that need versus projects built on greenfield locations. So nothing that we're changing here would alter the amount of tier 2 eligible projects that are built. It's simply about helping to ensure that they are built as cost effectively as possible.
Ms. Smith?
Regarding the preferred site maps in municipal energy plans, I've looked at a lot of them and worked with some towns and seen how they've come about it. And they really are operating in a vacuum. They don't have grid information. In one town, I said, why don't you have GMP come in and talk to you? Because I've said that in a couple of towns. The preferred site maps, in one case, they're based on going around and talking to landowners, and the landowners saying, "Yeah, I'm fine with it." Some of them involve clear cutting forests. I mean, there's no real rationale for how those maps are being developed, and I'm not a fan of those for that reason. I do think that the preferred sites that are in statute make sense. I think the reliance on the municipal energy preferred site maps are there are a lot of deficiencies in those. This 10 megawatt question, I really want to go back to the amount of acreage involved, and by promoting something like that, I think that what is being actually promoted is clear cutting 25 to 50 acres of forest, or covering agricultural fields, which we can't afford to lose more of. So the idea initially, as it was pitched, was the goal is to minimize the development on greenfields and maximize the development on brownfields. And I want to make sure we keep that focus. And so I want to know, where are those 50-acre brownfields that this could be done on? Where is a 10 megawatt site on a brownfield? Because right now I'm not seeing it.
And Margolis? You're on mute.
I think I'd be better at this by now. I can't answer that very specific question, Annette, but I just want to say a few things about the preferred sites. You know, this has been a work in progress by the regional planning commissions and the municipalities, and it relies on state level mapping. And there's different types of maps that the regions produce, and they help their municipalities create. And there's one type of map, which is potential sites. So those are sites that have good resource potential, like good solar potential, that do not have natural resources that are of concern, whether they're prime ag soils, forest blocks, wetlands, etc. Whatever map layers are available from the state is what they can map, and they can gray out those areas, and what's left are potential sites. Potential sites are different than preferred sites. Preferred sites require proactively saying we want development here, here, and here, which has been problematic for the regions and municipalities because it feels a lot to them like zoning. That is how we arrived at the preferred site letter, where the municipalities can say, or the regions can say, we've looked at this specific project proposal from a developer. We, it agrees, it comports with our land use policies and regulations that are expressed in our town plan or regional plan in the following ways, and therefore it is a preferred site. That's been the mechanism that works the best for the regions and municipalities because they don't want to take that next step and create zoning level maps that change potentially property values, et cetera. It is a compromise. It's not the preferred sites are supposed to be in those potential areas, so unconstrained by natural resource impacts. They have whatever grid data that they can get, which is when the utilities have provided grid maps, grid capacity maps. And then it is a local process to go through and say, and then that varies. We've seen in different cases, there's various ways that that goes through more or less process to say, this is a preferred site or not. But I think I just want to recognize that that is a compromise. And if we restrict these sites to just landfills, gravel pits, et cetera, those things that are not the preferred site, which is the more discretionary piece, that is one way to go. It's very clear cut and would, if it were part of this definition or part of future renewable energy incentive programs, et cetera, it would be a smaller universe of sites. There are a lot of existing sites that were developed by preferred site letter that I think by allowing that preferred site letter to continue to be part of this, this is a bigger conversation about how do we determine what a preferred site is, and does it include local preferred sites, and do they have to be mapped, which is unlikely, or can they be in a letter? So this is not restricted to this conversation here, but I think what we are talking about is potentially allowing through this definition a lot more co-location than has been feasible in the past. And yes, it's going to be co-located or it's going to be somewhere else up to meet tier 2 of the res, that total amount. But we do have some tools, whether it's the preferred site construct or the maps that the utilities and transmission utility have put together to say, these are less problematic sites. And it's going to be reviewed in the 248 criteria, absolutely, for on-site specific environmental impacts, grid impacts. But this is trying to narrow the universe to say, if we're going to allow a lot more of this co-location, which maybe communities, neighbors, et cetera, are not anticipating, let's try to be a little thoughtful about where we allow that to happen. Understand we all come at this from different perspectives, but department's perspectives, you should try to eliminate the number of conflicts you're setting yourself up for in that 248 process by trying to lean in on non-constrained sites and also preferred sites.
Ms. Janda?
Hi, Ann Janda. I'm an energy project manager with Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. I just want to make a couple of points. The first being that most of the municipalities that do decide to work on a preferred site letter, the work is being done by energy committees who are volunteers who may or may not have good education on how to do this. They may or may not be working closely with their regional planning commissions. And that can affect the quality of those letters as well. I also want to point out that we too have noticed some issues with the ANR maps here and there. They may not be accurate with what's on the ground. They may not take into consideration current development like golf courses that we've noticed recently and things like that. So we do see a lot of difficulty in creating preferred sites at the municipal level. And also like small municipalities that have low amount of professional staff really have difficulty interpreting all the data that they receive from regional planning commissions, and that the information can end up just sitting on a shelf until a developer arrives and says they're interested in a particular project. And we don't think that that process is going extremely well. At certain municipalities, at other municipalities, a few in our region, it does go fairly well.
Thank you. I want to give Alco and Mr. Malone an opportunity to describe the proposal they have put together and submitted in this proceeding, and then anyone who has questions on that proposal before making some final remarks for comments from the parties going forward.
Sure. Thanks, Steph. Our proposal is obviously, I think, the most simple and straightforward, and that I think is, kind of the point is to provide some sort of guidance to developers where they can understand what co-location means in Vermont. And I understand that it's a tricky question, but I think that the department's definition raises more questions than anything else. So the first point is just simplicity. The second point that I'd like to make, and that I was alluding to earlier when I was asking questions about differentiating between state incentive programs and other developers just participating in the market. The DPS definition really seems to hone in and target developers who participate in those state renewable programs based on the assumption that there would be a negative impact on the ratepayers. And so my ask is that DPS and the PUC take a closer look at that assumption. I think that the rates paid under at least the standard offer program in our PPAs in particular, they reflect avoided costs, which the utilities would otherwise be required to pay under federal law. And it also reflects what some of the utilities are currently paying themselves for utility-owned generation. And also, as Jonathan Dowds made the point earlier, all these proposed facilities do go through the very cumbersome 248 criteria process before the PUC. And one of those criteria is the economic benefit analysis. So, the PUC is going to be looking at that criteria anyway. So I think kind of that artificial distinction between what's deemed quote unquote incentive programs really has to be looked at further. That's all. That's all I have.
Any participants have any questions on the ALCO proposal? Ms. Smith.
So I'm wondering if you could please be very specific. What are the state incentive programs that you're talking about?
I'm specifically talking about standard offer program. I think the
Tell the
definition
Supreme Court
that
last week that the standard offer program is not an incentive program.
yes, that's my entire point.
So you're telling us it is or it isn't?
Well, it's labeled as an incentive program, and my comment is that it really shouldn't be, because I don't really think it's offering any sort of incentive to developers.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions or concerns on ALCO's proposal? Okay. So first, I'll just thank everyone for making the time today to have this conversation. It, I think, is helpful to get everyone in the same virtual room to talk through some of the words on the page. To that extent, the reason that we're going to put out sort of the draft recommendation to the legislature for comment rather than do another round of comments following this workshop immediately is it would be extremely helpful, given the short timeline we have for this process and where we are in the process, that folks orient their comments toward parts of the proposal, proposed legislative language that work and don't work and why, instead of commenting at the higher level, which is also, of course, welcome. But our task is to provide the legislature with a new definition, a new proposed definition of plant. And in doing that work, having feedback, you could go many different directions with the wording and think you're capturing the comments or the concerns, and we might not get that right, or we might not understand fully the language that would accomplish the goal that you're proposing be accomplished in the definition. So when that proposal comes out, we're going to give an opportunity for comment. If it could be focused in whatever areas of concern you have on language changes, deletions, additions, etc., rather than simply stating points that the definition as proposed does or does not address, or concerns or questions that you have about it. I also want to stress in this process that the definition of plant is a statutory definition. The commission doesn't have a single plant rule. We certainly have elements of the definition of plant that come into our rules. That metering rule has been referenced today, and I heard certainly in the department's feedback in this workshop that there may be a need for future proceedings based on where the definition lands. So if folks can provide commentary also on this does belong in the definition or does not belong in the definition, and it would belong, let's say, in a rulemaking or in commission cases or in commission orders, but not in the definition itself for whatever reasons, it's hard to show the legislature what would be going on not inside of the statutory definition, if that makes sense, in our own proceedings. So having feedback from participants about what belongs in that definition and what doesn't is helpful as well, if that makes sense. So any final thoughts, questions, or concerns about next steps? Billy Coster.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. And can I just encourage the commission when putting forward a proposal, if appropriate, to distinguish between co-location opportunities where there's an existing plant and a new facility will be added that location, and co-location under a scenario where there's two new projects being proposed at the same location at the same time, because I think those present different questions and considerations. Thank you.
Mr. Watson?
Thank you, Steph. Can I just ask, is it the commission's intent to meet that November 1st deadline, or if there's really significant feedback in the next round, is there any discussion about asking for more time to submit the amended definition, just for folks working on their timeline here?
The intent right now is to meet the deadline. That is where we're headed, and we recognize that that certainly is a short timeline, but we don't view this as the end of the conversation. Obviously, the legislature still would have to choose to take it up, and there'll be much debate there, I'm sure.
Great, thank you.
Ms. Smith?
Will you be issuing a post-workshop memo outlining the things that you've asked parties to comment on, or should we just review the videotape or remember what you said?
All are great options. We are going to issue the recommendation and include instructions or include kind of a cover to that recommendation that asks for feedback. And it will be consistent with what we've asked for today. All right.
I would
well,
just I would just note, given the abbreviated timeline, folks could expect we would be looking for comments sometime in mid to late October.
All right. Thank you all so much for your time today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you.